My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a pediatric trauma nurse in Columbus, Ohio. Every shift reminds me that children remember the moments adults think they'll forget. That's probably why I still own a small brass house key tied to a faded blue ribbon. It hangs inside my kitchen drawer instead of opening any door. 26 years ago, that key represented home. Today, it reminds me how easily adults can lock a child out without ever changing the lock. The person who understood that best wasn't my mother or my father. It was my grandmother, Evelyn. Every weekday, she woke at 5:30 a.m., packed my lunch in the same blue lunchbox covered with tiny white daisies, tucked a handwritten note beneath my sandwich, and polished that brass key before slipping it around my neck on its blue ribbon. "This means you always belong somewhere," she'd whisper. She never missed a morning. Then, on Tuesday, September 17th, 1996, at exactly 3:42 p.m., everything she believed she was protecting was undone by a single message my parents sent. I didn't understand it then. I only remember looking down at the key resting against my school sweater while standing alone outside Jefferson Middle School, wondering whether home could disappear without moving. Years later, that same brass key would sit on a polished oak conference table while two people who had once called themselves my parents couldn't look me in the eye. But that part comes much later. To understand why a 12-year-old stopped believing adults always came back, you have to understand my family. We weren't loud. We weren't obviously cruel. We were the kind of family neighbors described as solid. My father, Richard, managed a construction company. My mother, Susan, taught piano lessons from home. My older brother, Daniel, was 4 years older than me and, according to nearly everyone in our family, destined for something extraordinary. Daniel played varsity baseball. Daniel earned straight A's. Daniel needed rides. Daniel needed new equipment. Daniel needed quiet. Without anyone saying it directly, I learned that whatever Daniel needed automatically became more important than what anyone else wanted. Especially me. The ranking system never appeared on paper. It existed in little moments. If there was one piece of cake left, it belonged to Daniel because he's growing. If two people needed a ride, Daniel's practice always came first. If birthdays landed close together, his party got the bigger budget because he's older. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they taught me exactly where I stood. I wasn't unloved. I was simply optional. The only person who quietly pushed against that invisible order was Grandma Evelyn. Whenever she visited on Saturdays, she'd notice the little things no one else did. She'd cut my sandwich into stars because she remembered I liked them that way. She'd ask about my spelling tests before asking Daniel about baseball. She never treated my stories like interruptions. Once, when I was 11, she noticed the blue ribbon holding my brass key had started to fray. Without saying anything, she replaced it with a new ribbon while I slept. The next morning she smiled and said, "Some things deserve to stay tied together." At the time, I thought she was talking about the ribbon. Now I know she wasn't. The strange part is that I helped keep the family system alive. When teachers praised Daniel more than me, I nodded. When relatives forgot my achievements, I smiled anyway. When my parents canceled something we'd planned because Daniel had another tournament, I told everyone it wasn't a big deal. It became easier to agree than to ask why. Looking back, that's the hardest truth to admit. I wasn't only the child being overlooked. I became the child who defended being overlooked. By the time I turned 12, I'd become so practiced at accepting less that I could predict every family decision before anyone spoke. If Daniel needed something, the answer was yes. If I needed something, the answer depended on whether it inconvenienced someone else. Still, there was one promise my parents had never broken. Every weekday, one of them picked me up outside Jefferson Middle School at 3:40 p.m. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't special. It was simply what parents did. Or at least, that's what I believed. The week everything changed, I made sure there couldn't be any misunderstanding. On Sunday night, while clearing dinner plates, I reminded my mother that school dismissed early on Tuesday because of teacher meetings. "I know," she answered without looking up from the calendar. On Monday morning, I mentioned it again while Dad searched for his truck keys. "I heard you the first time," he said. Monday evening, Grandma Evelyn asked who was picking me up. "Dad," my mother replied. Even Grandma nodded, satisfied. Tuesday morning, before leaving for school, I asked one last time. Dad laughed, grabbed his coffee, and reached for the front door. Then he looked over his shoulder with the same expression I'd seen 100 times before. "Figure it out. The world won't wait for you." Everyone chuckled. It sounded like another one of his harmless sayings. Even I smiled. None of us knew those exact words would become the sentence that divided my life into before and after. The final bell rang at 3:15 p.m., and by 3:32, most of the parking lot outside Jefferson Middle School had emptied. I stood beneath the same maple tree where my father always stopped the truck. The brass key on its blue ribbon rested against my chest, warm from the afternoon sun. I wasn't worried. My parents had never forgotten me before. At 3:42 p.m., the secretary stepped outside holding the cordless office phone. "Claire? Your mother wants you." I hurried over, expecting to hear she'd been caught in traffic. Instead, her voice was calm, almost distracted. "Your father had to take Daniel across town for baseball. You'll have to find your own way home." I blinked. "It's almost 6 miles. There was a brief silence before she answered. "You're 12 now." Then my father spoke from somewhere in the background, loud enough for me to hear. "Figure it out. The world won't wait for you." The line went dead. For several seconds, I simply stared at the phone in the secretary's hand. She frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Did they say they're sending someone else?" I shook my head. She offered to let me wait inside the office, but I knew the building closed early because of the teacher meeting. Nobody could stay with me indefinitely. So I started walking. The first mile wasn't frightening. It was confusing. I kept expecting to hear our blue pickup pull alongside the curb. Every engine made me turn around. Every blue vehicle made my heart jump. None of them stopped. The September sun was still bright, but the sidewalks gradually emptied. Children disappeared into houses where parents were already waiting. I crossed 3 busy intersections I'd only ever seen through the passenger window. Halfway home, the strap on my backpack snapped. Books spilled across the sidewalk. A man walking his dog helped me gather everything without asking questions. He smiled politely, wished me luck, and continued on his way. That small kindness stayed with me longer than anything my parents said that afternoon. By the 3rd mile, my feet hurt. By the 4th, I stopped expecting rescue. I untied the blue ribbon around my neck and wrapped it around the broken backpack strap just tightly enough to keep the bag together. The brass key swung against the fabric with every step. Grandma Evelyn had once said, "Some things deserve to stay tied together." I wondered if families were supposed to be one of those things. When I finally reached our street just after 5:20 p.m., my father's truck was already in the driveway. Daniel's baseball gear lay scattered across the garage floor. Inside, everyone was eating spaghetti. No one looked surprised to see me. Dad glanced toward the clock. "Took you long enough." Mom placed another plate on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to ask whether they'd realized how scared I'd been. Instead, I quietly washed my hands and sat down. Grandma Evelyn noticed the dirt on my shoes. She looked from me to my parents, understanding more than anyone said aloud. She never raised her voice. She simply reached across the table and touched the brass key still hanging from its blue ribbon. Her hand stayed there for a moment. That silent gesture said more than an argument ever could. That night, I lay awake replaying the afternoon. But the memories didn't stop at that day. They pulled older moments into focus. The school concert where Dad left before my solo because Daniel had batting practice. The science fair ribbon Mom forgot to pick up because she was buying Daniel new cleats. The birthdays where my presents always seemed a little smaller, a little fewer, a little later. Each memory had once seemed harmless by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The hardest part wasn't realizing I'd been treated differently. It was realizing how often I'd defended it. Whenever friends asked why my parents missed another event, I'd answer for them. Whenever relatives praised Daniel and overlooked me, I'd tell myself it didn't matter. I had become an expert at making excuses for people who never asked me to. That realization hurt more than the 6-mile walk. Over the next few weeks, nothing changed. My parents acted as though Tuesday had been an ordinary inconvenience. If I mentioned it, Dad shrugged. You made it home. As if survival erased responsibility. As if fear expired the moment I reached the driveway. I tried talking to my aunt during a family dinner. She smiled sympathetically before saying, "Your father grew up tougher than you did. Don't make it a thing." My uncle laughed. I walked farther than that when I was your age. Even my 7th grade guidance counselor suggested that maybe my parents wanted to teach independence. Each explanation sounded reasonable enough to silence me. Each one told me the same thing in different words. What happened wasn't important. So I stopped talking about it. A month later, Grandma Evelyn picked me up from school without telling anyone. She drove slowly past the route I'd walked alone. At every busy intersection, she quietly shook her head. When we reached home, she parked the car but didn't turn off the engine. She looked straight ahead for a long moment before speaking. What happened to you wasn't a lesson. I waited. It was abandonment. No one had ever called it that before. Not fear. Not independence. Not growing up. Abandonment. Hearing the right word didn't erase what happened. But it gave 12-year-old me something I hadn't realized I'd been searching for since 3:42 p.m. that Tuesday. Permission to believe I hadn't imagined the hurt. Permission to stop carrying all of it alone. And for the first time since I began that 6-mile walk home with a brass key bouncing against my chest, I understood that the problem had never been whether I could find my own way home. The problem was that the people who were supposed to bring me there had chosen not to. Grandma Evelyn's words stayed with me far longer than she ever knew. What happened to you wasn't a lesson. It was abandonment. For years, I repeated that sentence silently whenever I caught myself making excuses for my parents. It became the line that separated reality from the story I'd been taught to believe. I left home 3 weeks after my 18th birthday with $412 in my checking account, 2 duffel bags, and the same brass key tied to its blue ribbon. I rented a tiny studio apartment above a hardware store. The radiator knocked every winter, the windows leaked when it rained, and I could hear my neighbor practicing the trumpet every evening at 7:00 p.m. It was the safest place I had ever lived. Not because it was comfortable. Because nobody there made me wonder whether I mattered. I worked double shifts as a nursing assistant while attending community college. Later, I earned my nursing degree, then specialized in pediatric trauma. Every frightened child I met reminded me of the 12-year-old girl who had stood outside Jefferson Middle School believing she simply wasn't important enough to pick up. Whenever I saw a parent rush into the emergency department, still wearing work boots or business clothes, apologizing for arriving 2 minutes late, I felt something complicated. Some people moved mountains just to reach their children. Mine couldn't drive 6 miles. My parents called occasionally during those years. The conversations were polite. Birthdays. Christmas. Weather. Never Tuesday. Never the walk. Never the phone call at 3:42 p.m. It was as though an entire afternoon had been erased from family history. Then, when I was 36, Grandma Evelyn died peacefully at 89. She left me very little in terms of money. But inside a small wooden box was the brass key on its faded blue ribbon and a handwritten note. Asterisk, a home isn't where someone lets you in. It's where nobody makes you earn the right to enter. Asterisk. I cried harder over that note than I had at her funeral. After the estate was settled, my parents suggested we put the past behind us. I decided to give them one genuine opportunity. Not because they deserved it. Because I wanted to know I'd done everything I reasonably could. I invited them to meet me for coffee on March 14 at 10:00 a.m. at the little cafe Grandma loved. I wasn't asking for punishment. I wasn't asking for public apologies. I only wanted acknowledgement. I need you to tell me that leaving me to walk home alone at 12 was wrong, I said quietly. Neither of them answered immediately. Dad stirred his coffee. Mom looked out the window. Finally, Dad sighed. You're still stuck on that? I've built my whole life around not abandoning people. It was one afternoon. It changed everything. He leaned back in his chair with the same expression I'd seen since childhood. Figure it out. The world won't wait for you. There it was again. 24 years later. The exact same sentence. As though time itself had never moved. Mom finally spoke. If you keep bringing this up, people will think we're terrible parents. Dad added another layer. If you force us to choose between you and the rest of the family, don't expect anyone to take your side. Then came the guilt. Your brother's children shouldn't lose their grandparents because you can't let go. In less than 5 minutes, they'd managed to turn accountability into my responsibility. Their reputation, their relationships, their comfort. Everything mattered more than the frightened 12-year-old they had left behind. I finished my coffee, thanked them for meeting me, and walked outside. That afternoon, I stopped trying to earn a better place inside the family I'd been born into. Instead, I decided to build one that operated by different rules. One where nobody ranked higher because they were louder. One where children never questioned whether someone would come for them. One where love wasn't measured against inconvenience. A week later, I bought a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street. The first thing I hung inside wasn't a family photograph. It was Grandma Evelyn's brass key inside a simple wooden shadow box near the front door. Every guest asked about it. Every time I smiled and said the same thing. It reminds me what home is supposed to mean. When holidays came around, I continued sending invitations to my parents. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner. Their names stayed on the guest list. Not because I expected them to come. Because I refused to become someone who excluded people out of revenge. Generosity isn't weakness. Sometimes it's proof that someone else failed to teach you kindness. Eventually, I realized something else. I hadn't spent 26 years trying to make my parents understand me. I'd spent 26 years hoping they'd become different people. Those aren't the same thing. The day I accepted that truth was the day I stopped waiting beside emotional doorways that were never going to open. A locked door only controls you if you keep standing outside it. Mine had been unlocked the moment I decided to walk away instead of knocking again. 3 months before my 38th birthday, something happened I never expected. On a rainy Saturday at 9:18 a.m., my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I saw my mother and father standing on the porch. Neither had called. Neither had been invited. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I looked at the shadow box beside the door where Grandma Evelyn's brass key still hung from its faded blue ribbon. I remembered something she used to tell me. Asterisk, you never have to answer a door just because someone knocks. Asterisk. So I didn't. Not immediately. I finished making my tea. I watered the fern in the kitchen window. Only after nearly 12 minutes did I unlock the door. They looked older. Smaller somehow. Time had done what arguments never could. Dad tried speaking first. We've been standing out here. I know. You could have let us in sooner. I wanted to be sure I was opening the door because I chose to, not because I felt obligated. For the first time in my life, he didn't have an answer ready. Mom stepped forward carefully. We just want things to go back to normal. There wasn't anything normal about leaving a 12-year-old to walk 6 miles home. Dad sighed, reaching for the old familiar pattern. You've always been too sensitive. The words landed without impact. They no longer described me. They only described the version of me that had once believed them. When that failed, Mom tried another approach. We're getting older. Do you really want to spend the rest of our lives holding on to this? I haven't been holding on to it, I answered quietly. I built a life beyond it. Silence settled between us. Not angry, just honest. Then Dad asked something I had never imagined hearing. His voice was softer than I'd ever known it. Is there anything we can still do? It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even an apology. But it was the first genuine question either of them had asked about my pain. I thought carefully before answering. This has never been about me. Both of them looked confused. I pointed toward the framed brass key. You taught me that children could be left behind when something more important came along. If you truly want to change anything, start with the children in this family. By then, Daniel had 2 daughters, 8 and 10 years old. They deserve grandparents who always show up. Dad lowered his eyes. Mom quietly nodded. I invited them inside. Not because everything had been repaired. Because conversations deserve chairs more than front porches. Hours later, Daniel arrived with his daughters after I'd called him. No one expected what happened next. The girls ran straight to Grandpa. He hesitated. Then, instead of answering a phone buzzing in his pocket, he silenced it and knelt to hug them both. It was a tiny moment. Most people would have forgotten it within minutes. I didn't. Because 26 years earlier, another decision involving a ringing phone had changed my life. Later that afternoon, my parents asked to speak privately with Daniel's older daughter. She had recently told her parents she sometimes worried adults forgot about kids when they became busy. The conversation lasted nearly half an hour. I never listened at the door. I never asked exactly what was said. Some moments belong only to the people brave enough to have them. When they came back into the living room, my mother's eyes were red. Dad looked exhausted. The little girl hugged both of them before asking whether everyone wanted homemade cookies. Children have a remarkable way of accepting sincere effort without pretending the past never happened. Over the next 18 months, life found a quieter rhythm. Sunday dinners replaced the tense holiday gatherings that had once revolved around status and obligation. Everyone brought one dish. Everyone helped clean afterward. Nobody had assigned seats anymore. There was no invisible ranking system. Just people sharing a table. My father developed one habit that nobody commented on aloud. Whenever the grandchildren arrived somewhere, a school concert, a soccer game, a birthday party, he came 15 minutes early. Every single time. He never explained why. He didn't have to. Some apologies are spoken. Others arrive early and wait. My mother began keeping extra backpacks, snacks, and jackets in her car. If one of the girls ever needs me, she'd say, "I'm ready." Again, she never connected it to my story. She simply behaved differently. That mattered more. As for me, I never told my parents I completely forgave them. That would have been dishonest. Some injuries become part of who you are. They don't disappear. They become the reason you refuse to pass the wound forward. Every year on September 17, I still take the brass key from its shadow box. I hold it for a moment before hanging it back. Not because it opens any door. Because it reminds me that home is never defined by walls, addresses, or the people who first claimed the title of family. It's defined by the people who make sure no child ever has to wonder whether someone is coming. I was 12 years old when my parents told me to grow up and find my own way home. I was 38 when I finally understood that finding my own way home had never meant returning to the house I left behind. It meant building one where no child would ever hear, "Figure it out. The world won't wait for you." Because the strongest families aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones that never leave a child believing they have to find their way home alone.